there's a massive slippage in the logic of this. I mean, they start off with the Cartesian view that there are these two kinds of things, minds and bodies, but they follow Descartes. They agree totally with Descartes and Descartes would totally agree with this. When it comes to bodies, it's mechanism which counts, right? I said, okay, René, that's fine. So we agree with you totally. We just want to throw the mind out, right? And so we have embodied beings, but understood purely mechanistically. And of course, this doesn't follow. But it's very interesting to read them because they never really face that. They just assume that. And I've just heard Dennett speak a few months ago. It's exactly the same thing. You know, if you don't explain your conscious reasoning in terms of all the little, the little sort of gremlins there that are dumber and dumber and dumber and dumber, then you're not materialist, he said, looking horror and audience. Then you have some spooky stuff in there. Then, it's not science. You can see this because if you look at the way in which this kind of reduction is attempted, really, which is using computer theory, partly with some help from connectionism and so on, in order to understand our intelligent performances as kinds of computation, right? You see that they can, if this explanation were actually to work, a computer model of the human mind were actually to work, you could see how they could recuperate 3 of the 4 kinds of meanings that I laid out here, which I didn't put on the board, right? They can give a perfectly good explanation of nausea. I mean, as it just triggers this off, they can give a very good explanation of why the normal human perception of color comes out with the answers it does. They can give a perfectly good explanation, supposedly, of why it's wired into us to find that what creates human suffering is something we don't like. What creates human well-being is something that we react to. We can, positively. We can even give certain. I mean, take the whole selfish gene idea, the Dawkins selfish gene idea. You see, this is something that can explain why we have super sympathy for some people, for kin, and not for others. I mean, the idea is that a gene, of course, operates with a whole collection of genes that form an organism, but a gene that makes it more likely that whole collection will reproduce itself in the next generation, will itself, of course, be more widely spread in the next generation, and so on and so on. So you get the famous idea of the selfish gene, which is a very bad, very stupid image. I mean, a metaphor which constantly, they keep saying it's not a metaphor on the next page. They obviously are taking it totally seriously. I mean, they say admit it's a metaphor, and then they begin to take it totally seriously. But you can see how this works, and this can even explain why, if people get, as a matter of fact, a cathexis on their kin, and therefore do all sorts of things for the kin that they wouldn't do for others, and even sacrificing themselves, well, yeah, this will produce a situation. If what did Haldane say? I would sacrifice myself for 4 cousins and 6 aunts or whatever. You can see how this pattern, according to their way of calculating, would spread the gene wider. See, so all these things can be explained, but what couldn't be explained is the perception of real intrinsic meaning. Why? Well, because if this isn't a real issue, what is really higher, really better, and so on, then in cases of non-delusion, in cases where I'm not deluded, it would have to be the case that something's falling under the category of really meaningful, really good, etc., would draw me. In other words, it would have real causal power in those cases, that real causal power of drawing me towards it. But this is an impossible property to fit into a mechanistic account in pure efficient causation, right? Because how could a property of really fitting a certain normative concept be one that, as it were, allowed the entities instantiating it to have this constant causal power? The only thing that could have a constant causal power is something that is just brute cathected, something of, X or Y that is operative and powerful because it is brutally cathected, and then it would be so. So in order to recognize the efficacy of this kind of discernment, you'd have to translate it into the other kind. You have to move it from the Aristotle category to what I'm calling the Hume category, right? And then you can do everything else, supposedly. See? Because if you allow the computer model of the mind, all kinds of instrumental reason can be coped with by, according to this mechanistic account, then consciousness really gets that a little bit, but then they divide it up into three things. Consciousness is in one sense self-consciousness, so some notion of the self figures, and well, that could be in a computation. And then another element of it is the conscious planning, and if that's instrumental reason, well, that can fit supposedly into the explanation. What can't be fitted into is raw feels or sentience. Well, let's forget that for a moment. But they think they can get everything, but what they can't get is intrinsic value. As a matter of fact, there's something even, I have to read you this last thing from Pinker's, How the Mind Works. There's certain pathos in this. He comes to the end of the book, and he says, I've got this theory which is a mixture of sort of computer causal account and a evolutionary account. Wow, I mean, you can't get more. And it shows exactly how the mind works. And it really can explain everything. Now, there are just a few things I can't fit into this, and there's a list of 6. Consciousness, the self, free will, meaning, knowledge, and morality. I mean, apart from these trivial questions, they're in cahoots, these two standpoints, or the extreme standpoints. There's a very interesting line in Pinker in which, of course, people gave him a lot of trouble about his evolutionary psychology and so on. Well, aren't you buying into sexism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they say, well, I mean, if you have all these, genes obviously in you that are pushing you to behave as a man in a totally sexist way and so on, what do you do about that? And he said, well, I tell my genes to go jump in the lake. But that's a very interesting remark, because suddenly you have almost a Sartrean type of, radical choice here. But why do these things, they do fit together, you see, because that whole objectivizing standpoint implicitly puts the subject in a situation of incredible control and domination, which, of course, is sometimes an invitation to a totally technocratic approach, right? If we really understand this, we're going to advise governments and we'll be able to organize the world. And, Skinner thought we would get totally rid of alienation altogether if we just had nobody brought up by their parents, we bring up all the kids. Okay, so we'd be more bonkers than we are today. But it can be that kind of total control, or it can be, well, I'm totally master of my own house. I decide, my values tell me not, so I'm going to control this. There's a kind of flip between these two, which is easy to do because there's an underground sympathy between the two. There has to be a kind of distorted self-understanding. You see, if you think that you can totally understand yourself from that third-person standpoint, and there has to be a devaluing of the kinds of intuitions on which we all live in actually carrying out our lives. But people can live in a kind of split-level way. I mean, I once knew a friend of mine who had a friend of his who was, they're both rational choice theorists. And the friend was saying, oh, God, it's a terrible decision. I mean, this woman I'm with, well, she wants it to become more serious, and do I marry her or not? And so his friend said, well, let's settle the matrix. And he said, no, this is serious. At a certain point, life breaks in.